1953, Fidel Castro starts his revolutions and leads an unsuccessful revolt against the Batista regime. Later in 1959, Castro leads a 9,000-strong guerrilla army into Havana, forcing Batista to flee. Castro becomes the prime minister, allowing his reign of terror to begin. In 1960, all businesses are nationalized without compensation. Due to this, all business executives leaving there began to flee to the United States. 1980, 125,000 refugees flee Cuba during a brief lift of restrictions. All of this leads up to and takes place during the Cuban exodus to the United States. The overall combination of the rising tensions, corruptions, and ultimately led to Castro taking power. Once Castro's revolution began, the Cubans started to realize their fate. From 1960 to 1995, many Cubans chose to flee Cuba to escape to America, to escape from Castro's wrath. The Cubans were able to do this due to the lack of migrant regulations for Cubans. Furthermore, due to political relations, Cuba had a special place in the few migration laws that existed. The migration of the Cubans was a voluntary step migration. First, one relative of the family member would cross, and then later he or she would send for the rest of the family to come across. This allowed for the person to get established in the U.S. and be able to support the others coming over. The start of this 200,000 Cuban exodus started all because of Castro's revolution. The Cuban refugee program handles immigrants to Miami, with 300,000 immigrants relocated across the U.S. during the next 20 years. Various small organizations began because of this exodus to help those in need of crossing. Majority of the Cubans fled to either Florida Keys or Florida mainland. There is still a higher population of Cubans there today than anywhere else in the U.S. For one short period of time, migrants were allowed to, by Castro, to bring $5, otherwise they had to bring themselves and what they wore. The third wave of Cuban immigrants began after the fall of 1965, when Castro announced that all Cubans with relatives living in the United States would be allowed to leave through the port of Camarioca. He invited exiles to come to Cuba by sea and collect their relatives, as commercial flights between Cuba and the United States had been discontinued in the wake of the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. A major push factor was that Castro imprisoned enemies of the state, as well as some did not have favorable life in Cuba, and wanted to start somewhere they could prosper without Castro. One pull factor was that America offered liberty, which was what many Cubans desired. For a while, Cubans were turned away unless they stated that they had fear of prosecution by Castro. This was done under the 1995 wet foot policy. They were either sent back to Cuba or Guantanamo Bay. Under the Obama administration, the wet foot policy was terminated January of 2017.
Freedom flights were created to help Cubans coming over. Freedom flights were the few limited flights from Cuba to America. 300,000 Cubans arrived this way from 1965 to 1973. Cuba shot down a Brothers to the Rescue plane in 1996. The Brothers to the Rescue program was started by Jose Basulto to help Cubans trying to cross to America. They would take seaplanes and fly towards Cuba in hopes to find rafts full of Cubans. They would then land, load the Cubans up, and fly back to the United States. Once relations began to form again, visa limits were set and restricted the amount of Cubans allowed to come to the United States. In 1995, Cuban visas were limited to 20,000 visas a year. This same year, Cubans no longer had preferential treatment anymore for migration to the United States. Overall, 56,406 Cubans entered the United States via ports of entry in fiscal year 2016, up 31% from fiscal 2015, when only 43,159 Cubans entered the same way, according to the latest U.S. Customs and Border Protection data. Most Cubans in 2016 were crossing into the USA from Mexico. They would first cross the ocean to Mexico and then travel up Mexico to the Rio Grande. Once they arrived at the river, they would carefully cross the river into the United States. In recent years, however, they are no longer able to do this due to the Obama administration. 2015, more than 43,000 Cubans entered without visas, up 78% from the previous year and a six-fold increase from the start of the Obama administration. This surge results from Cuba's loosening travel rules and, more recently, a fear that special privileges for Cuban migrants might end with the thawing of relations. In 2017, near the end of the Obama administration, President Obama ended the wet foot, dry foot policy, therefore causing Cuban nationals who try to enter the country without visas and who did not qualify for humanitarian help will be removed from the country. This has affected many Cubans attempting to still get into the United States and causing families to be separated for longer. In recent years, Cubans are not refugees seeking freedom. They're not escapees hopping a tropical Berlin Wall. They're coming for jobs, family, and access to American welfare, just like other migrants. That's why it's long past time to take another look into the Cuban Adjustment Act and have one immigration policy for everybody. Many Cubans were already familiar with the United States, which they had often visited for business or pleasure before the Cuban Revolution. Some also had business or personal contacts in the country to help them adjust. In addition, since Cuban culture itself was highly Americanized before the 1960s, the American way of life was not altogether alien to them. As of the 2013 count, there are more than 1.24 million Cuban immigrants that have entered the United States of America. Even today, they are still flooding in. However, they are not crossing through the ocean to get here. They are walking through customs just like other immigrants coming to the United States.